Every generation ship is a tomb in slow motion. We're designing coffins and calling them starships. Generation ships sound magnificent, floating cities carrying humanity to the stars across centuries. But behind the beautiful concept lurks a nightmare of radiation, genetic collapse, and mathematical impossibilities. If you're fascinated by humanity's struggle against the universe's indifference, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Every video explores the cutting edge of space science. Now let's get started. The concept sounds straightforward enough. We build an enormous spacecraft, pack it with thousands of people, launch it toward a potentially habitable exoplanet, and let generations live and die during the journey. The original crew's great-grandchildren would be the ones to finally walk on alien soil. Scientists call these hypothetical vessels world ships, and they've captured our imagination for nearly a century. The earliest generation ship story appeared in 1940 when writer Don Wilcox published The Voyage That Lasted 600 Years. Since then, countless books, films, and television shows have explored this concept. But imagination and engineering are very different things. Project Hyperion, a competition organized by the Initiative for Interstellar Studies in 2024, asked teams worldwide to design a realistic generation ship for a journey lasting 250 years. The scenario assumed technological advances that could push our spacecraft to around 12% the speed of light. Even at this ambitious velocity, we're talking about multiple human lifetimes spent in the void. 250 years is longer than the United States has existed as a nation. It's longer than the Industrial Revolution. It spans roughly 10 human generations. Think about that. 10 complete turnovers of society, all confined within metal walls, hurtling through absolute darkness. The scale of the vessel itself presents immediate engineering nightmares. To support a viable population for centuries, you need space. Lots of it. We're not talking about a cramped space station like the International Space Station, where currently 6 or 7 astronauts share about 916 cubic meters of pressurized volume. A generation ship would need to be orders of magnitude larger. Proposed designs include massive rotating cylinders to create artificial gravity through centrifugal force, similar to the O'Neill cylinder concept first proposed by physicist Gerard O'Neill in 1976. These cylinders might measure several kilometers in length and 1 or 2 kilometers in diameter. The internal surface area would need to accommodate housing, agriculture, industry, recreation, and wilderness reserves to maintain psychological health. Building such a structure in space requires resources beyond anything humanity has attempted. The International Space Station, our most complex space construction project to date, measures about 109 meters across at its widest point and has a mass of approximately 420,000 kilograms. It cost roughly $150 billion and took over a decade to assemble, requiring dozens of rocket launches. A generation ship would dwarf this achievement. We're talking about a structure with a mass potentially measured in millions or billions of kilograms. The amount of material, the energy required for construction, and the precision engineering needed to ensure everything functions reliably for centuries makes our current space infrastructure look like a child's toy. Now, here's where things get particularly interesting. You can't just build a big ship, fill it with people, and point it at the stars. Every single system aboard must function with near-perfect reliability for the entire journey. There are no rescue missions in interstellar space, no resupply runs, no calling home for replacement parts. If something breaks, the crew must fix it using only what they have on board. This demands an entirely closed-loop life support system, something we've never successfully created despite decades of research. Think about the air you're breathing right now. On Earth, our atmosphere is maintained by an incredibly complex interplay of geological processes, ocean chemistry, and billions of years of biological evolution. Plants produce oxygen through photosynthesis, bacteria cycle nitrogen, oceans absorb carbon dioxide. The entire system is self-regulating, resilient, and vast beyond measure. On a generation ship, you need to replicate all of this within a sealed container. Every breath exhaled by thousands of people needs to be scrubbed of carbon dioxide, replenished with oxygen, and maintained at exactly the right pressure and composition. For centuries, NASA and the European Space Agency have researched closed-loop life support extensively. The MELISA project, which stands for Micro-Ecological Life Support System Alternative, has been working since 1989 to develop a system using microorganisms and plants to recycle waste into food, water, and oxygen. Despite decades of research, we still haven't achieved a truly closed system. There are always losses, inefficiencies, and unexpected failures. The famous Biosphere 2 experiment in Arizona, conducted in the early 1990s, attempted to create a sealed ecosystem supporting 8 humans for 2 years. The project encountered serious problems. Oxygen levels dropped unexpectedly, carbon dioxide accumulated, nitrogen levels in the soil became depleted. The crew eventually required oxygen to be pumped in from outside. If we can't maintain a closed system on Earth, where we have unlimited resources and expert support just outside the walls, how can we expect to do it for centuries in deep space? By the way, speaking of the challenges of the space environment, the temperatures out there present their own nightmare. I covered this in detail in my video called "The Terrifying Truth About How Cold Space Really Is" on the card above, where I break down exactly what happens to matter and energy in the cosmic void. The link is in the description. The thermal management systems on a generation ship would need to balance heat generation from thousands of people, machinery, and nuclear reactors against the need to radiate excess heat into the near absolute zero vacuum. It's a delicate dance that must never fail. Water presents another critical challenge. Humans need approximately 2 to 3 liters per day for drinking alone, not counting cooking, hygiene, agriculture, and industrial processes. For a population of 1,000 people over 250 years, that's somewhere around 227 million liters of water just for drinking. Every drop must be recycled endlessly. Urine, sweat, wastewater from showers and laundry, all of it purified and reused. The International Space Station recycles about 93% of its water, but that remaining 7% loss is made up by resupply missions. On a generation ship, there are no resupply missions. Even a 1% loss per cycle, compounded over centuries, would eventually drain the reserves. And what happens when the recycling system fails? What's the backup? And the backup to the backup? Food production might be the most complex challenge of all. You can't pack 250 years worth of food. It would take up too much mass and volume, and much of it would degrade despite preservation efforts. The crew must grow their own food continuously. This means agriculture in space, using hydroponics or aeroponics systems where plants grow in nutrient solutions or mist environments without soil. These systems can be efficient, but they're also finicky. They require precise control of nutrients, pH levels, lighting, temperature, and humidity. They're vulnerable to disease, pest infestations, and equipment failures. A single blight could wipe out critical crops. Let's talk numbers. An adult human requires roughly 2,000 calories per day. For 1,000 people over 250 years, that's approximately 182 billion calories that must be produced on board. The agricultural system needs to be productive enough to feed everyone diverse enough to provide complete nutrition, and resilient enough to survive inevitable crop failures. You need backup crops, seed banks, and the knowledge to maintain dozens of different species of plants. You need pollinators, either insects or robotic systems. You need to manage the entire food web within your enclosed habitat. One mistake, one pathogen that gets out of control, and people starve. The radiation environment in deep space represents perhaps the most insidious threat to generation ships, one that operates invisibly but relentlessly. Here on Earth, we're protected by two magnificent shields, our planet's magnetic field and our atmosphere. The magnetosphere deflects most charged particles coming from the sun and deep space, while our atmosphere absorbs what gets through. Step outside this protective bubble, and you enter a shooting gallery of high-energy particles that can shred biological tissue and degrade materials over time. There are two primary sources of radiation in interstellar space. First, we have solar particle events, massive eruptions from our sun that spew billions of tons of charged particles into space at velocities approaching the speed of light. These events are sporadic but potentially deadly. During a major solar storm, radiation doses can spike to lethal levels within hours. The second and more persistent threat comes from galactic cosmic rays, or GCRs. These are high-energy particles, primarily protons and heavier atomic nuclei, that originate from supernova explosions and other violent cosmic events throughout our galaxy. They travel at enormous speeds and carry tremendous energy. What makes galactic cosmic rays particularly dangerous is their composition. While many are simple protons, a significant fraction consists of what scientists call HZE particles, high atomic number and high-energy nuclei. These include carbon, oxygen, silicon, and iron nuclei traveling at relativistic speeds. When one of these particles passes through living tissue, it doesn't just damage a few molecules like lower-energy radiation might. It creates a track of destruction, ionizing thousands of atoms along its path, shattering DNA strands, creating free radicals, and triggering cascades of cellular damage. A single iron nucleus traveling at 95% the speed of light can tear through dozens of cells in a straight line, leaving devastation in its wake. Research published in 2025 by teams from the University of Strasbourg examined the effects of cosmic radiation on multi-generational populations aboard hypothetical generation ships. The findings were sobering. Even with substantial shielding, cosmic rays penetrate deep into the spacecraft. When high-energy particles hit the hull, they don't just stop. They interact with the shielding material, creating showers of secondary particles, neutrons, gamma rays, lighter nuclei. Sometimes the shielding actually makes things worse, a phenomenon called secondary radiation. The very walls meant to protect you become sources of additional exposure. The biological consequences accumulate over time. NASA's current radiation exposure limits for astronauts are based on a 3% risk of exposure-induced death at the 95% confidence interval. This primarily considers cancer risk, which has long been understood as the dominant radiation hazard. However, recent epidemiological studies have revealed that radiation also significantly increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. When you combine cancer risk with circulatory disease risk, predictions for a Mars mission, which would only last about 3 years, suggest that central estimates for radiation-induced mortality could exceed 5%, with upper confidence intervals approaching 10%. For a generation ship journey lasting 250 years, everyone aboard would accumulate doses far exceeding anything we currently consider acceptable. But cancer and heart disease are just the beginning. Recent research has identified serious concerns about radiation damage to the central nervous system. High-energy particles passing through the brain can damage neurons, trigger inflammation, and disrupt cognitive function. Studies with animals exposed to simulated cosmic ray environments show impaired memory, reduced problem-solving abilities, and behavioral changes. Imagine an entire population slowly experiencing cognitive decline over generations. The engineers maintaining critical systems, the doctors treating patients, the leaders making crucial decisions, all potentially compromised by accumulated radiation damage to their brains. There's also the genetic dimension. Cosmic rays cause mutations. Most mutations are harmless or simply lethal to individual cells, but some alter the germline, the eggs and sperm that create the next generation. A population confined to a spacecraft, bombarded continuously by high-energy radiation, would experience a mutation rate far higher than on Earth. Over 10 generations, the genetic consequences could be profound. The research from Strasbourg specifically modeled this, incorporating the effects of radiation-induced mutations on life expectancy, fertility, pregnancy success rates, and miscarriage rates. Their simulations showed that if shielding fails to adequately protect the crew, or if it degrades over time, the genetic structure of the population shifts dramatically. Natural selection would operate differently in this environment, potentially favoring traits that have nothing to do with the mission's success. Let's discuss shielding in more detail, because this is where the engineering challenges become almost comically difficult. The most effective shielding against cosmic rays is mass. Lots of it. Dense materials like lead are actually poor choices because heavy nuclei create more secondary radiation when struck by cosmic rays. Better options include hydrogen-rich materials, water, polyethylene, or even food and waste materials arranged around living quarters. But here's the catch. Effective shielding requires meters of thickness. Studies suggest you'd need at least 5 to 10 meters of water-equivalent shielding to reduce cosmic ray doses to marginally acceptable levels. Now, do the math. Water has a density of 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter. If you're shielding a cylindrical habitat 1 kilometer long and 500 meters in diameter with 5 meters of water-equivalent material, you're adding approximately 15 million cubic meters of shielding mass. That's 15 billion kilograms just for radiation protection. This is in addition to the structural mass of the ship, the life support systems, the agricultural modules, the fuel, and everything else. The energy required to accelerate this much mass to 12% of light speed is astronomical, possibly requiring the entire energy output of a small star. Some proposals suggest using active shielding instead, powerful magnetic fields that mimic Earth's magnetosphere, deflecting charged particles before they reach the crew. This sounds elegant, but the technical challenges are immense. You'd need superconducting magnets generating fields strong enough to deflect particles traveling at near light speed, sustained continuously for centuries. The energy requirements are staggering. The magnets themselves would be massive, and if the system ever fails, perhaps due to a micrometeorite strike damaging critical components, the crew loses protection instantly. Then there's the threat of physical impacts. Interstellar space isn't empty. It contains dust, microscopic particles, and occasionally larger debris. When you're traveling at 12% of light speed, approximately 36,000 kilometers per second, even a grain of sand carries devastating kinetic energy. The kinetic energy of an object is 1/2 mass times velocity squared. A dust grain with a mass of 1 milligram traveling at 36,000 kilometers per second relative to your ship carries kinetic energy of approximately 648 megajoules. That's equivalent to about 155 kilograms of TNT. A single dust grain could punch through metal hull plating like it wasn't there. Protecting against hypervelocity impacts requires additional shielding layers, typically a Whipple shield design, spaced layers of material designed to vaporize incoming particles and spread their energy across a wider area before they reach the inner hull. This adds yet more mass to an already impossibly heavy spacecraft, and larger objects, perhaps a pebble-sized rock, could potentially be catastrophic regardless of shielding. There's no way to detect such objects in advance when you're traveling at these speeds. The closing velocity is simply too high. By the time light from the object reaches your sensors, you've already hit it. The propulsion system itself presents a cascade of nearly insurmountable problems. To reach 12% of light speed, you need to accelerate millions or billions of kilograms to 36,000 kilometers per second. No chemical rocket could possibly achieve this. The exhaust velocity of even the most energetic chemical reactions is measured in single-digit kilometers per second. The rocket equation, formulated by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in 1897, tells us that the final velocity of a rocket depends on the exhaust velocity of the propellant and the ratio of initial mass to final mass. To achieve high final velocities with low exhaust velocities requires mass ratios that quickly become absurd. Nuclear propulsion offers better performance. Project Orion, conceived in the 1950s, proposed using nuclear bombs detonated behind a spacecraft to create thrust. Each explosion would push against a massive pusher plate, gradually accelerating the craft. In principle, this could achieve a few percent of light speed, but it requires thousands of nuclear devices, incredibly robust shock absorption systems, and a pusher plate that can withstand repeated nuclear detonations without degrading. The engineering challenges are extraordinary, and nobody has ever tested such a system beyond small-scale prototype. Fusion propulsion, like that proposed in Project Daedalus, designed by the British Interplanetary Society in the 1970s, offers even better theoretical performance. Fusing hydrogen isotopes releases far more energy per unit mass than fission. A fusion rocket could potentially achieve 10 to 12% of light speed. However, we haven't yet achieved sustained, controlled fusion power on Earth despite 70 years of intensive research. The latest fusion experiments, like the National Ignition Facility's achievement of fusion ignition in 2022, are significant milestones, but we're still decades away from practical fusion reactors, let alone compact fusion drives suitable for spacecraft. Some visionaries propose even more exotic systems. The Bussard ramjet, conceived by Robert Bussard in 1960, would scoop up hydrogen from the interstellar medium using enormous electromagnetic fields, fuse it, and use the energy for propulsion. This elegant concept eliminates the need to carry fuel, but the interstellar medium is incredibly diffuse, containing perhaps one hydrogen atom per cubic centimeter. The scoop would need to be thousands of kilometers across to gather enough fuel. The drag from the scooping process might exceed the thrust produced. And again, we don't have working fusion reactors. Antimatter propulsion represents the theoretical pinnacle of rocket technology. When matter and antimatter meet, they annihilate completely, converting 100% of their mass into energy according to Einstein's famous equation. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. This is the most efficient energy release possible in the universe. A rocket powered by matter-antimatter annihilation could theoretically reach significant fractions of light speed. But here's the problem. Antimatter doesn't exist naturally in any appreciable quantity in our corner of the universe. We have to manufacture it, particle by particle, in massive accelerators like CERN's Large Hadron Collider. Creating antimatter is phenomenally expensive and inefficient. Current production rates measure in nanograms per year. The total amount of antimatter ever created by humanity wouldn't be enough to power a light bulb for more than a few minutes. To fuel a generation ship, you'd need kilograms or perhaps tons of antimatter. Even if we dramatically improved production efficiency, we'd need to store this antimatter safely for the duration of the journey. Antimatter annihilates instantly upon contact with normal matter, so it must be confined in electromagnetic traps, suspended in vacuum, never touching physical walls. Maintaining these traps for centuries without failure, while the ship vibrates, accelerates, and possibly takes impacts, is a staggering engineering challenge. A containment failure would release energy comparable to multiple nuclear weapons, likely destroying the ship instantly. Let's assume, optimistically, that we somehow solve propulsion. We build the ship, we accelerate it to cruise velocity, and we're coasting through interstellar space. Now we face what might be the most profound challenge of all: keeping humans and society functional and cohesive for centuries in total isolation. This isn't just an engineering problem, it's a sociological, psychological, and biological puzzle that cuts to the heart of what it means to be human, scarred with population genetics. How many people do you need aboard to maintain a genetically healthy population for 10 generations? This question has occupied researchers for decades. Early estimates suggested you might need only a few hundred individuals. More recent analyses paint a grimmer picture. A study published in 2025 examined this question using sophisticated population modeling. The researchers found that for large starting populations of around 500 individuals, genetic diversity can be maintained reasonably well under ideal conditions. But those conditions are critical. You need careful genetic management, essentially controlled breeding programs to maximize diversity and minimize inbreeding. The mathematics of population genetics involves concepts like effective population size, genetic drift, and the founder effect. When you start with a small population, you're sampling only a tiny fraction of humanity's total genetic diversity. Rare alleles, genetic variants that might be crucial for adaptation to unforeseen challenges, are likely absent. Over generations, random chance causes some genetic variants to become more common while others disappear entirely. This genetic drift is stronger in smaller populations. After 10 generations, your population's genetic makeup could look very different from the starting crew, potentially less diverse and more vulnerable to genetic diseases. Inbreeding becomes almost inevitable in small, closed populations. Even with careful genetic management using computer algorithms to optimize mate selection, you're working with a limited gene pool. The mathematics are unforgiving, with 500 starting individuals contributing to the breeding pool and assuming random mating. The inbreeding coefficient increases predictably with each generation. Higher inbreeding coefficients correlate with increased rates of genetic disorders, reduced fertility, higher infant mortality, and decreased overall fitness. In conservation biology, this is called an extinction vortex, a positive feedback loop where small population size leads to reduced fitness, which leads to smaller populations, accelerating toward collapse. But genetic management requires something deeply uncomfortable: restrictions on reproductive freedom. Someone or some system has to decide who mates with whom to optimize genetic diversity. This transforms one of the most intimate human choices into a managed resource allocation problem. The ethical implications are staggering. How do you enforce such policies across generations? What happens when individuals refuse to comply? Do you sterilize people whose genetic profiles are overrepresented? Do you use artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization exclusively, treating reproduction as a purely technical process? These measures might be necessary for population survival, but they fundamentally alter human society in ways we've historically considered dystopian. Let's talk about governance. Who makes decisions on a generation ship? Who has authority? And how is that authority legitimized and transferred across generations? On Earth, political systems derive legitimacy from various sources: democratic elections, hereditary succession, religious authority, revolutionary mandate, or simple force. On a generation ship, the original crew presumably volunteers for the mission, accepting its risks and constraints. But their children don't choose this life. They're born into it. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren have even less connection to the original mission. By the 10th generation, the people aboard have no living memory of Earth, no personal connection to the mission's goals. They're simply born into a metal tube hurtling through darkness, told that their purpose is to maintain systems and eventually colonize a world they'll never see. This creates a profound legitimacy crisis. Why should these later generations sacrifice their comfort, their freedom, perhaps their lives, for a mission they didn't choose? Historical precedent suggests this is a recipe for conflict. Isolated communities throughout human history, from island populations to remote outposts, often develop their own cultures that diverge dramatically from their origins. Sometimes these communities fracture into competing factions. Sometimes they abandon their original purposes entirely. On a generation ship, such conflicts could be catastrophic. Imagine a scenario where a charismatic leader arises in Generation 5, arguing that the mission is pointless, that they should slow down, turn around, or alter course to a different destination. Imagine religious movements developing, perhaps interpreting the journey in mystical terms, creating new doctrines that conflict with the mission's technical requirements. Imagine power struggles between different sections of the ship, perhaps the agricultural workers versus the engineers, each claiming their work is more essential and deserves greater resources and authority. There's no police force from outside to maintain order, no higher authority to appeal to. The ship's population must police itself, using whatever mechanisms they develop. History shows that isolated communities can descend into tyranny, violence, or chaos surprisingly quickly when external constraints are removed. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted in 1971, demonstrated how quickly ordinary people adopt abusive behaviors when given power in an isolated environment. The ship itself becomes a prison from which there's no escape. You can't leave. You can't call for help. You can't emigrate to a different society if you disagree with how things are run. You're trapped with whatever social system evolves, for better or worse. The psychological challenges might be even more severe than the political ones. Human psychology evolved in the context of Earth. Open skies, horizons, natural landscapes, weather, seasons, the sun and moon. We're adapted to a rich, complex, ever-changing environment. A generation ship, no matter how well designed, is fundamentally artificial and monotonous. You see the same walls, the same people, the same spaces every day for your entire life. The view outside, if there even are windows, is unchanging darkness with perhaps a slow drift of distant stars. There's no new frontier to explore, nowhere to go that you haven't been 1,000 times before. Psychological research on isolated and confined environments, from submarines to Antarctic research stations, consistently shows elevated rates of depression, anxiety, interpersonal conflict, and cognitive decline. These effects emerge even in highly trained, carefully selected personnel on missions lasting months. We're talking about random individuals, including children born aboard, confined for their entire lives. The rates of mental illness would likely be severe. How do you provide adequate mental health care in such an environment? How many psychologists and psychiatrists do you need in a population of 1,000 people experiencing these unique stressors? Then there's the problem of knowledge preservation and cultural drift. The ship requires people with highly specialized knowledge to maintain its systems. You need nuclear engineers who understand the power reactors. You need biologists who can manage the closed-loop ecosystem. You need medical doctors, computer scientists, mechanical engineers, materials scientists. You need farmers who understand the hydroponic systems. You need educators to train the next generation. This knowledge must be passed down reliably for centuries, but knowledge transmission is fragile. It requires dedicated education systems, extensive documentation, and motivated students. What happens when a critical expert dies unexpectedly before fully training a replacement? What happens when young people, seeing no immediate benefit from studying complex technical subjects, choose not to learn them? On Earth, we have universities, libraries, the internet, millions of experts in every field. On a generation ship, you might have only a handful of people who truly understand each critical system. Lose them, and you lose potentially irreplaceable knowledge. There's also the temptation to simplify. Imagine your Generation 7. You're maintaining systems designed by people who lived 200 years ago. The documentation is extensive but written in technical language that's increasingly archaic. Some systems have failed and been jury-rigged with workarounds. Other systems have been modified repeatedly, and the modifications poorly documented. You're inheriting an increasingly complex, increasingly fragile infrastructure that nobody fully understands anymore. The temptation to simplify, to shut down non-essential systems to reduce maintenance burden becomes overwhelming. But which systems are truly non-essential? Make the wrong choice, and you trigger cascading failures. Cultural evolution presents another insidious threat to mission success. Culture isn't static. Languages change, values shift, priorities evolve. The original mission culture, carefully designed to emphasize technical competence, cooperation, and long-term thinking, would inevitably transform over generations. New traditions would emerge, perhaps ones that conflict with mission objectives. Religions might develop interpreting the journey through spiritual frameworks. Social hierarchies would crystallize, potentially creating privileged classes and underclasses. Art, music, and storytelling would evolve in directions nobody can predict, consider language alone. English, as spoken today, is substantially different from the English of 250 years ago. In 1776, people used different vocabulary, different grammatical structures, different idioms. If you transported someone from that era to the present, they'd struggle to understand modern speech, and vice versa. Now imagine this linguistic drift happening in an isolated population. The language aboard the ship would diverge from Earth languages, developing unique vocabulary for ship-specific concepts, losing words for Earth phenomena nobody experiences anymore. By Generation 10, the crew might speak something barely recognizable as the original language. If they ever needed to communicate with Earth or read the original technical documentation, they'd face significant barriers. More fundamentally, the purpose of the mission itself might be reinterpreted or forgotten. The original crew understands why they're traveling to another star, to establish a new home for humanity, to ensure species survival, to explore all the cosmos. But these abstractions might mean little to people born aboard ship. Their world is the ship. They've never seen Earth. They've never breathed unrecycled air or felt natural sunlight. The destination exoplanet is equally abstract, a theoretical place they'll never reach in their lifetimes. Why should they care? Why should they sacrifice comfort and resources to maintain a trajectory toward a world that's just a story to them? This existential disconnect could manifest in various destructive ways. Perhaps the crew decides to slow down and extend the journey indefinitely, turning the ship into a permanent habitat rather than a transport vessel. Perhaps they decide the destination planet sounds dangerous and choose a different target or no target at all. Perhaps they simply stop maintaining non-essential systems, allowing the ship to degrade gradually. Without buy-in from each generation, without genuine commitment to the mission, failure becomes almost inevitable. Let's examine the biological realities of long-duration spaceflight in more detail. Beyond radiation, microgravity poses severe health challenges. On Earth, gravity constantly stresses our bones and muscles. This stress is essential for maintaining strength. Remove gravity and bones demineralize, muscles atrophy, cardiovascular systems weaken. Astronauts on the International Space Station exercise 2 to 3 hours daily just to slow this deterioration, and they still experience significant bone and muscle loss on missions lasting months. A generation ship needs artificial gravity to prevent these effects. The most practical method is rotation. Build a cylindrical or wheel-shaped habitat and spin it. Centrifugal force pushes objects outward, creating an acceleration that mimics gravity. The physics are straightforward. The acceleration experienced at the rim of a rotating cylinder is omega squared times radius, where omega is the angular velocity in radians per second. To create Earth-like gravity, approximately 9.8 meters per second squared, in a cylinder with a radius of 250 meters, you need to spin it at roughly 0.2 radians per second, or about 1.9 rotations per minute. This sounds manageable, but it introduces complications. First, building a massive rotating structure in space is mechanically complex. You need bearings or magnetic levitation systems that can support enormous loads while allowing smooth rotation for centuries without maintenance. Any wobble or imbalance could create destructive vibrations. You need to manage angular momentum carefully, because any change in the distribution of mass inside the habitat affects the rotation rate. When people move around, when you shift cargo, when you grow crops, you're redistributing mass, creating torques that need to be counteracted. There's also the Coriolis effect. In a rotating reference frame, moving objects appear to curve. Stand up quickly in a rotating habitat, and you'll feel disoriented as the Coriolis force pushes you sideways. Drop something, and instead of falling straight down, it appears to curve. Throw a ball, and its trajectory is bizarrely distorted. Humans can adapt to weak Coriolis effects, but the effect's strength depends on rotation rate. Slower rotation rates reduce the Coriolis effect, but require larger radius habitats to maintain the same artificial gravity. Smaller habitats must spin faster, creating stronger Coriolis effects that cause motion sickness, disorientation, and difficulty with fine motor control. Research conducted on rotating environments suggests that rotation rates above about 2 revolutions per minute become uncomfortable for most people, causing persistent nausea and disorientation. This sets a minimum radius for comfortable habitats. To generate one Earth gravity with a rotation rate of 2 rpm, you need a radius of at least about 224 meters. That's a habitat nearly half a kilometer across. The structural engineering required to build such a massive spinning structure, ensure its balance, and keep it spinning smoothly for centuries is extraordinary. Then consider what happens if the rotation stops. Perhaps a bearing fails. Perhaps a micrometeorite strike damages the rotation mechanism. Perhaps an internal explosion or accident creates forces that overcome the rotation systems. Suddenly, everyone aboard experiences weightlessness. Without immediate repair, bones start weakening, muscles atrophy, people become sick. If the rotation can't be restored quickly, you might have to rebuild the entire mechanism while dealing with a crew that's rapidly losing physical strength. In weightlessness, even simple repairs become difficult. Tools float away. You can't brace yourself properly. Physical work is exhausting because you're fighting Newton's third law with every motion. Medical care aboard a generation ship faces unique challenges. You need doctors, nurses, medical equipment, and pharmaceuticals sufficient to treat every possible condition that might arise in a population of hundreds or thousands over centuries. But medical knowledge and technology advance rapidly. The medical practices considered state-of-the-art when the ship launches will be obsolete within decades. New diseases might emerge, possibly unique to the ship's environment. Genetic drift and radiation-induced mutations could create novel genetic disorders unknown on Earth. Pharmaceuticals have shelf lives. Even with careful storage, most drugs degrade over time, becoming less effective or even toxic. You can't stockpile 250 years' worth of medications, they'd spoil. The ship needs pharmaceutical manufacturing capability, which means laboratories, skilled chemists, access to raw materials, and knowledge of synthesis pathways for hundreds of different compounds. If a critical drug becomes unavailable because the raw materials run out or the knowledge of how to synthesize it is lost, people die. Surgery presents special challenges. Even with artificial gravity, the sterile environment required for surgery is difficult to maintain. On Earth, hospitals fight constant battles against infection using powerful HVAC systems, strict protocols, and abundant resources. On a ship, if antibiotic-resistant bacteria emerge, they can't be escaped. The entire population shares the same recycled air and water. An outbreak of a resistant pathogen could be catastrophic. You can't open the windows for fresh air. You can't import new antibiotics from pharmaceutical companies. You have only what you can produce on board. Childbirth, normally a natural process, becomes a critical mission element. Every birth must be successful for population stability. Infant mortality rates need to be extremely low, but pregnancy and childbirth carry inherent risks even with modern medicine. Complications like eclampsia, hemorrhage, or obstructed labor can kill both mother and child without immediate expert intervention. You need obstetric specialists, surgical facilities, blood banks. How many obstetricians does a population of 1,000 require? What happens if they all die in an accident before training replacements? One generation without adequate obstetric care could see maternal and infant mortality rates spike, threatening population stability. There's also the question of genetic screening and selective reproduction. To maintain genetic health, you might need to screen embryos for genetic disorders, implant only healthy embryos, and prevent carriers of certain conditions from reproducing. This is eugenics, a term loaded with horrific historical connotations. Yet the alternative might be allowing genetic disorders to proliferate in the population, causing suffering and reducing overall fitness. The ethical dilemmas are agonizing and unavoidable. Let's discuss resource management in greater depth. A generation ship is the ultimate closed economy. Every atom aboard must be accounted for and recycled endlessly. Nothing can be wasted. Nothing can be imported. The total mass of resources available when the ship launches is all you'll ever have. This creates economic constraints unlike anything in human history. On Earth, economies grow by exploiting new resources, discovering new oil fields, mining new mineral deposits, clearing new farmland. Even in sustainable economies, there's exchange with the broader biosphere and geosphere. Waste products get dispersed into oceans or atmosphere to be processed by geological and biological cycles operating at planetary scales. On a generation ship, there's nowhere to dump waste. Everything you discard stays with you. Every system must approach 100% efficiency, which thermodynamics tells us is impossible. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy disorder always increases in closed systems. Perfect recycling is impossible because every process involves some energy degradation and material dispersion. When you recycle metal, tiny amounts are lost to slag or oxidation. When you purify water, some is lost to evaporation or remains contaminated beyond recovery. When you recycle nutrients from waste, some compounds break down into forms that plants can't use. Over decades and centuries, these tiny losses accumulate. Slowly, inexorably, the total amount of usable resources decreases. Think about metals. The ship's structure, machinery, tools, and equipment contain iron, aluminum, copper, titanium, and dozens of other elements. These metals corrode, wear down, and occasionally fail catastrophically. When a pipe bursts, some metal is lost. When a bearing wears out, microscopic particles are dispersed. You can recycle scrap metal, melting it down and reforming it, but each recycling cycle loses a small percentage. After hundreds of recycling iterations, you've lost significant amounts. Eventually, critical materials might become scarce. This is especially true for rare elements. Modern electronics require elements like indium, tantalum, and rare earth metals. These are present in tiny quantities in most ores, making them difficult to extract and refine. The ship would carry limited amounts of these elements, primarily in manufactured electronics. When those electronics fail, you must recover and recycle these rare elements. But if you lack the sophisticated equipment and expertise to do so, those elements become unrecoverable, locked in broken devices. Without them, you can't manufacture replacement electronics. Critical systems dependent on those electronics fail permanently. Energy management is equally critical. The ship needs enormous amounts of energy continuously. Energy to maintain life support, grow food, recycle waste, provide lighting, run computers, power medical equipment, and maintain rotation. The only practical energy source for a multi-century journey is nuclear power, either fission reactors using uranium or thorium, or fusion reactors if that technology becomes viable. Solar power is useless in deep interstellar space far from any star. Chemical fuels don't contain enough energy per unit mass. Nuclear fission reactors require fuel. Uranium-235 or plutonium-239 undergo fission, releasing energy and creating radioactive waste products. A reactor operating for centuries consumes significant amounts of fuel. You must carry that fuel from the start, adding mass to the ship. The waste products, intensely radioactive fission fragments, must be stored safely for thousands of years. They can't be dumped overboard. You'd contaminate the ship's trajectory and possibly create a navigation hazard. They must be shielded and contained within the ship indefinitely, taking up volume and mass. Reactor components wear out. The reactor vessel itself becomes brittle from neutron bombardment, a process called neutron embrittlement. Control rods degrade, heat exchangers corrode. Eventually, the reactor must be decommissioned and replaced. This means you need multiple complete reactors aboard, or the ability to manufacture reactor components from raw materials. Manufacturing reactor-grade materials requires sophisticated metallurgy, precision engineering, and quality control far beyond ordinary industrial processes. A single flaw in a reactor pressure vessel could cause catastrophic failure, releasing radiation that contaminates the entire ship. Information technology presents its own cascade of problems. Modern spacecraft rely heavily on computers for navigation, life support management, monitoring, and communications. These computers must function reliably for centuries, but electronic components fail. Cosmic radiation causes single-event upsets where a high-energy particle flips a bit in computer memory, potentially crashing systems or corrupting data. Redundancy helps, but you need multiple backup systems, all of which require maintenance and eventually fail. Stored media degrades over time. Hard drives fail mechanically. Solid-state memory can lose data through charge leakage. Even archival media like optical discs deteriorate over decades. The ship's entire knowledge base, all technical documentation, all cultural records, all navigation data, must be preserved perfectly for the entire journey. This requires multiple redundant copies on different media types, regular verification and recopying to fresh media. It also requires people with the expertise to maintain these systems and the discipline to actually perform these tedious maintenance tasks. Generation after generation, software presents unique challenges. Modern software is incredibly complex, consisting of millions or billions of lines of code. This code inevitably contains bugs, some of which might not manifest until specific rare conditions occur. When a critical bug appears decades into the journey, who can fix it? The original programmers are long dead. Their successors might lack deep understanding of the code's architecture. They might try to patch the problem, introducing new bugs. Over generations, as patches accumulate on patches, the software becomes an incomprehensible tangle, increasingly fragile and prone to catastrophic failure. There's also the problem of technological obsolescence. The computers and software aboard the ship represent the state of the art when the ship launches, but technology advances rapidly on Earth. Within decades, the ship's systems would be hopelessly outdated by Earth standards. This might seem irrelevant since the ship is isolated, but consider the implications. If something breaks and you need to redesign it, you're working with old technology. You can't simply download updated designs from Earth. Communication time lags make that impractical, and by the time you're years into the journey, you're too far away for meaningful communication. You're stuck with whatever knowledge and technology you brought with you, trying to solve problems that might be trivial with newer technology, but are extremely difficult with what you have. Navigation across interstellar distances requires extraordinary precision. When you launch, you point the ship toward where the target star will be in 250 years, accounting for its motion relative to the Sun and your own trajectory. Any error in initial trajectory, any unplanned course correction, any unexpected gravitational influence from interstellar matter can cause you to miss the target by enormous distances. Space is vast, and course errors compound over time. To navigate accurately, you need to know your position and velocity precisely at all times. This requires sophisticated sensors, star trackers that identify constellations and measure angles, atomic clocks that keep time with extraordinary precision, and accelerometers that measure every change in velocity. These instruments must remain calibrated for centuries. A star tracker that drifts slightly out of alignment, an atomic clock that gains or loses even microseconds, an accelerometer with a tiny bias, all accumulate errors that translate into massive position uncertainties. If you discover midway through the journey that you're off course, correcting it requires changing your velocity, but you have limited fuel for course corrections. The ship is traveling at 12% of light speed, carrying enormous kinetic energy. Changing direction, even slightly, requires enormous energy expenditure. If you've already used your fuel for the initial acceleration, You might have nothing left for major corrections. You'd be forced to continue on the wrong trajectory, missing your destination entirely, dooming everyone aboard to die in the void between stars. Communication with Earth becomes increasingly difficult and eventually impossible as distance increases. Radio signals travel at the speed of light. When the ship is 1 light-year away, a message takes 1 year to reach Earth, and the response takes another year. At 5 light-years, it's a 10-year round trip. By the time you're halfway to a destination 10 light-years away, communication delays make real-time conversation impossible. You send a message asking for help with a problem. 10 years later, you receive a response that might be obsolete because the situation has changed. And Earth's response is based on information that's 10 years old. Eventually, distance makes communication impractical or impossible. The radio signal spreads out over space, weakening according to the inverse square law. At enormous distances, the signal becomes indistinguishable from background noise. You'd need impossibly large transmitters and receivers to communicate. The ship becomes truly isolated, cut off from Earth forever. Whatever problems you face alone. The destination itself presents a whole new layer of challenges that are rarely discussed in optimistic visions of generation ships. We've talked about getting there, but what happens when you arrive? Suppose, miraculously, everything works. The ship survives the journey, the population remains viable, the systems continue functioning, and you successfully decelerate and enter orbit around your target exoplanet. Now what? First, consider that everything we know about the planet comes from observations made from Earth before the ship launched. We can detect exoplanets through various methods. The transit method watches for tiny dips in starlight as a planet passes in front of its star. Radial velocity measurements detect wobbles in the star's motion caused by orbiting planet, and direct imaging captures actual photons from the planet itself. These techniques tell us about the planet's size, mass, orbital period, and potentially some atmospheric characteristics. But they reveal almost nothing about surface conditions. Is the surface solid or covered in deep oceans? Are there continents? What's the atmospheric pressure at ground level? Is the atmosphere breathable, toxic, or corrosive? What's the temperature range? Does the planet have a magnetic field to protect against radiation? Are there active volcanoes, severe storms, earthquake zones? We won't know any of this with certainty until the ship arrives. Imagine traveling for 250 years only to discover the planet is completely uninhabitable. Perhaps a runaway greenhouse world with surface temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, or a frozen ice ball with no atmosphere, or a world with atmospheric pressure so high it would crush human bodies instantly. Even if the planet is broadly habitable, there are likely significant differences from Earth. The gravity might be 20 or 30% stronger or weaker, affecting human health and development. Children born on a high-gravity world might develop stronger bones and muscles, but experience cardiovascular stress. On a low-gravity world, they might grow unusually tall but develop weakened skeletons prone to fractures. The atmospheric composition almost certainly differs from Earth's. Oxygen levels might be lower, requiring supplementation, or higher, creating fire hazards. Other gases present might be toxic in the long term, even if not immediately lethal. The day-night cycle is probably different. If the planet orbits closer to its star with a shorter orbital period, years might be only a few Earth months long. If the planet is tidally locked, one side permanently faces the star, while the other side remains in eternal darkness, with only a narrow twilight zone potentially habitable. If the planet rotates much faster or slower than Earth, day-night cycles could be hours or hundreds of hours long, creating temperature extremes and weather patterns unlike anything on Earth. Human biology evolved with a roughly 24-hour circadian rhythm. Adapting to radically different day lengths could cause persistent sleep disorders, metabolic problems, and psychological stress. Then there's biology. If the planet has liquid water and has existed in the habitable zone for billions of years, it might have developed life. This would be the most exciting discovery in human history, but also potentially the most dangerous. Alien biochemistry might be completely incompatible with Earth life, or it might be similar enough to interact in unpredictable ways. Alien microorganisms might invade human bodies, causing infections that our immune systems can't recognize or fight. Conversely, Earth microorganisms brought by the colonists might devastate the alien ecosystem, making us the invasive species. Even if alien life isn't harmful, its mere presence complicates colonization enormously. Can you eat native organisms? They might not provide usable nutrients. Their proteins might be based on different amino acids that human biochemistry can't process. They might contain toxins that accumulate in human tissue. The colonists might need to subsist entirely on food grown from Earth organisms, requiring them to establish sealed agricultural systems similar to what they had aboard ship. Hardly the liberation they'd hoped for. Landing on the planet requires vehicles, fuel, and infrastructure. The generation ship itself probably can't land. It's a massive structure designed for space, not atmospheric flight. You need specialized landing craft, essentially large-scale versions of the Apollo lunar lander or Mars landers. These craft must carry people, equipment, supplies, and prefabricated habitat modules from orbit to the surface. Each trip requires significant fuel, which must either be carried from Earth or manufactured using local resources. Manufacturing fuel from local resources requires finding and processing appropriate materials. On Mars, we could potentially extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and combine it with hydrogen to create methane fuel. On an exoplanet, we don't know what's available. If the atmosphere lacks useful chemicals, if water is scarce or deeply buried, if the surface is chemically inert rock, manufacturing fuel becomes difficult or impossible. The colonists might get a few trips to the surface and then become stranded, unable to shuttle more people or equipment down from orbit. Establishing a viable colony on the surface requires incredible amounts of infrastructure. You need habitats that protect against the local environment, provide breathable atmosphere and comfortable temperature, and shield against radiation. You need power generation, probably solar panels if the star provides adequate light, or nuclear reactors if it doesn't. You need agriculture, initially in controlled greenhouses, eventually expanding to open-field farming if the soil and atmosphere permit. You need water purification, waste processing, manufacturing capability, medical facilities, and everything else needed for a self-sufficient settlement. All of this must be carried aboard the generation ship as cargo. The ship isn't just transporting people, it's carrying the entire industrial base needed to bootstrap a new civilization. This adds enormously to the ship's mass. Every kilogram of cargo is a kilogram that must be accelerated to cruise velocity and then decelerated at the destination. The energy requirements spiral upward. You could potentially reduce cargo mass by manufacturing things from asteroid materials during the journey, but that requires mobile mining and manufacturing facilities, robotics, and expertise to operate them, all of which add complexity and failure points. Let's consider the human factor at the destination. Remember, the people who arrive have never lived on a planet. They've spent their entire lives aboard the ship, in artificial gravity, breathing recycled air, under artificial lighting. For them, the ship is normal. It's all they've ever known. A planetary surface might be profoundly disorienting and frightening, the open sky extending infinitely upward instead of curving into walls. Weather, wind, rain, clouds, storms, phenomena they've only read about. Uncontrolled nature, insects, plants growing chaotically, soil teeming with microorganisms, animals moving about unpredictably. For people raised in the ship's controlled environment, this could provoke anxiety, agoraphobia, even terror. There's also the question of whether they'll even want to colonize the planet. By Generation 10, the ship is their home. Their ancestors' stories about Earth are ancient history, myths essentially. The destination planet is also just a concept, not something they've experienced. When they arrive and see this alien world with its strange sun, bizarre sky color, unfamiliar gravity, and unknown dangers, will they embrace it? Or will they decide to remain aboard ship, perhaps entering a stable orbit and living there indefinitely? This wouldn't be irrational. If the ship's systems are functioning, why risk everything by colonizing an alien world? The ship is a known quantity. Yes, it's cramped and limited, but it's safe and familiar. The planet is a vast unknown with countless ways to kill you. A significant portion of the population might refuse to participate in colonization. This could split the community, creating bitter conflict between those who want to settle the planet and those who want to remain aboard ship. With limited resources and no external authority, such conflicts could turn violent. Suppose colonization proceeds. The initial settlement is tiny, perhaps a few dozen or 100 people living in prefab habitats. They're entirely dependent on equipment brought from the ship. Any failure could be catastrophic. A habitat breach, a power system failure, a crop failure, contaminated water, a medical emergency with no adequate facilities, all could kill people. And unlike aboard ship where there's nowhere to go, on a planet's surface there might be temptations to explore, to venture into unknown territory where rescue is impossible. The colony must grow from a tiny outpost to a self-sustaining settlement, and eventually to a civilization capable of preserving and advancing human knowledge and culture. This process takes generations, perhaps centuries. During this vulnerable period, any number of disasters could wipe out the colony: a plague, crop failures leading to starvation, equipment failures that can't be repaired, social collapse, warfare between factions, or hostile native life forms. Consider the historical parallels. European colonies in the Americas, Australia, and elsewhere often struggled despite having regular resupply from their home countries. The Roanoke colony vanished without a trace. Jamestown nearly failed multiple times due to starvation, disease, and conflict with native populations. These colonies had the advantage of a habitable environment with breathable air, drinkable water, and edible organisms. An exoplanet colony has none of these guarantees and receives no resupply ever. There's also the timeline problem. The generation ship probably requires decades or even centuries to fully transfer its population and equipment to the surface. During this time, the ship must remain functional in orbit, continuing to provide life support for those who haven't yet descended. The ship's systems are now 250 years old or more, maintained across 10 generations, likely showing serious degradation. Keeping them operational while simultaneously trying to establish a surface colony divides your limited technical expertise between two enormous challenges. What happens if the ship suffers a catastrophic failure during this transition period? If life support fails while thousands of people are still aboard, they die. The surface colony, only partially established, receives no further support and might lack the population size or resources to survive independently. The entire mission fails at the final stage, perhaps with only a few survivors stranded on an alien world, genetically too few to maintain long-term viability. Let's zoom back out and consider the broader picture. Why are we even contemplating generation ships? The usual justification is species survival, spreading humanity to multiple worlds to ensure that a catastrophe on Earth doesn't mean extinction. This is sometimes called the backup Earth argument. If we colonize other star systems, then even if Earth suffers a nuclear war, asteroid impact, pandemic, or climate catastrophe, humanity survives elsewhere. But this logic has flaws. First, it assumes that whatever catastrophe threatens Earth is worse than the certainty of hardship and death facing generation ship crews. Nuclear war is terrible, but most humans would survive it. Climate change is a serious threat, but it won't render Earth less habitable than the void between stars or a barely surveyed exoplanet. Asteroids large enough to cause extinction are extremely rare. We'd likely detect them decades in advance and could potentially deflect them using far less technology than building generation ships. Second, the timescales don't align. Building a generation ship and sending it to another star would take at least a century of dedicated effort and resources. In that same century, we could solve most problems threatening Earth, develop sustainable energy, reverse environmental damage, establish robust space-based infrastructure for asteroid defense, cure diseases, and stabilize political systems. If we have the technological capability to build generation ships, we almost certainly have the capability to make Earth resilient against plausible catastrophes. Third, maintaining human civilization across multiple star systems provides no advantage on timescales shorter than millions of years. Yes, eventually the Sun will expand into a red giant and destroy Earth, but that's roughly 5 billion years away. Worrying about it now is like a single-celled organism 3 billion years ago worrying about the eventual evolution of mammals. The timescale is so vast that what we do now is irrelevant. On timescales of thousands or even millions of years, other concerns dominate. Will our species evolve into something unrecognizable? Will we develop technologies that make interstellar colonization trivial? Will we transcend biology entirely, uploading consciousness into machines or energy patterns? Planning for billion-year scenarios when we can barely predict the next decade is absurd. There's a more subtle argument for generation ships, the value of exploration and growth itself. Perhaps spreading through the cosmos is simply what intelligent species do, an expression of curiosity and ambition. Perhaps we should pursue it not because Earth is threatened, but because it's there to be done, the ultimate frontier. This romantic vision has driven human exploration throughout history, crossing oceans, climbing mountains, reaching the poles, traveling to the moon. But romantic visions rarely survive contact with reality. The age of exploration on Earth involved tremendous suffering, sailors dying of scurvy, malnutrition, disease, and shipwreck, explorers freezing in Arctic wastes, indigenous populations devastated by disease and violence. We romanticize these eras now, but for the people who lived through them, they were often desperate, brutal experiences. Generation ship crews would face similar or worse hardships, but without even the possibility of returning home or receiving rescue. Moreover, Earth-based exploration usually offered tangible benefits, trade routes, resources, territory, knowledge that could be applied at home. Interstellar colonization offers no comparable return. The colony is too far away to trade with Earth. Resources on an exoplanet can't be transported back across light years. Knowledge gained might be transmitted back via radio, but with decades or centuries of time delay, making it of limited value. The colony doesn't enrich Earth, it simply drains resources for no return. Some advocates suggest that advancing technology might make generation ships obsolete before we need them. Perhaps we'll develop faster-than-light travel, allowing us to reach other stars in days or weeks rather than centuries. Perhaps we'll achieve suspended animation or cryonic preservation, allowing us to freeze travelers for the journey and wake them at the destination. Perhaps we'll develop mind uploading, transmitting human consciousness as information at light speed and reconstituting it in artificial bodies at the destination. These speculative technologies would indeed solve many problems, but they're speculative precisely because they might be impossible. Faster-than-light travel appears to violate fundamental physics. Every theory that permits it requires exotic matter with negative energy density or other substances that might not exist. Suspended animation works for small organisms cooled to near freezing, but scaling it to adult humans for centuries introduces problems of ice crystal formation, cellular damage, and metabolic shutdown that we haven't solved despite decades of research. Mind uploading assumes consciousness is purely computational, which is philosophically controversial and requires technology to scan and simulate brains at neuron-level resolution, which is far beyond current capability. Banking on speculative technology is wishful thinking, not planning. If we're serious about interstellar colonization, we must design systems using physics and technology we understand, which means generation ships or something comparably difficult. And if generation ships are the best we can do, we need to honestly confront their enormous challenges rather than glossing over them with optimistic assumptions. There's an alternative approach that might be more feasible: robotic probes. Instead of sending humans, send sophisticated robots and artificial intelligence to other star systems. Robots don't need life support, food, or artificial gravity. They can tolerate radiation, acceleration, and long dormant periods. They don't experience psychological stress from isolation or confinement. They don't reproduce uncontrollably or suffer genetic drift. A robotic probe could be much smaller and lighter than a generation ship, requiring less fuel and lower cost. Upon arrival, robots could explore the destination, gather scientific data, and transmit it back to Earth. If the mission includes colonization, robots could use in situ resources to construct habitats, establish life support systems, and prepare the planet for human arrival. Then, once everything is ready, humans could travel there, either as embryos grown in artificial wombs, or as adult colonists in suspended animation, or even as digital consciousness uploaded into biological or robotic bodies manufactured on site. This approach dramatically reduces risk. If the probe fails, we've lost machines, not human lives. If the destination turns out to be uninhabitable, we've learned valuable information without condemning anyone to death. If technology advances during the probe's journey, we can incorporate improvements into the follow-up human mission. The probe becomes a scout, gathering reconnaissance that makes eventual human colonization far more likely to succeed. However, robotic probes introduce their own challenges. The artificial intelligence must be sophisticated enough to handle unforeseen situations autonomously, since communication delays prevent real-time control from Earth. The AI must be able to repair itself, adapt to unexpected conditions, and make complex decisions about resource allocation and priorities. Creating such robust AI is an immense challenge. Current AI systems, despite impressive capabilities in narrow domains, lack the general intelligence and adaptability required for long-duration autonomous operation in completely unknown environments. There's also the question of purpose. Why are we colonizing other stars? If it's to ensure human survival, then robotic probes don't accomplish that. They might prepare the way, but humans must still make the journey eventually. If it's for scientific knowledge, robotic probes excel. If it's for some intangible purpose like fulfilling humanity's destiny or satisfying our exploratory drive, then robots might feel unsatisfying, like winning a video game by watching someone else play. Let's examine some numbers to ground this discussion in reality. Suppose we want to send a generation ship to Proxima Centauri, the nearest star to Earth at about 4.24 light-years away. We want to travel at 12% of the speed of light to make the journey in about 35 years, minimizing the number of generations required. We'll use the rocket equation to estimate the mass requirements. The Tsiolkovsky rocket equation states that delta V equals V exhaust times the natural logarithm of initial mass divided by final mass. Here delta V is the change in velocity, and V exhaust is the exhaust velocity of the propellant. For a fusion rocket, a plausible advanced propulsion system, exhaust velocities might reach 3 to 5% of light speed, let's say 4%, or roughly 12 million meters per second. To accelerate to 12% of light speed, that's 36 million meters per second, we need a delta V of 36 million. Using the rocket equation, 36 million equals 12 million times natural log of mass ratio. Solving, natural log of mass ratio equals 3. Mass ratio equals e to the power of 3, approximately 20. This means for every kilogram of ship at cruise velocity, you needed 20 kilograms at the start, meaning 19 kilograms was propellant. But wait, you also need to decelerate at the destination, requiring another delta V of 36 million meters per second. Now the mass ratio compounds. If you need a mass ratio of 20 for deceleration, and you have to carry that deceleration propellant during acceleration, the total mass ratio becomes 20 times 20, equaling 400. For every kilogram of final ship mass, you need 400 kilograms at departure. Now suppose the ship needs to support 1,000 people for the journey. A generous estimate for life support, habitat, equipment, and supplies might be 100 metric tons per person, or 100,000 kilograms total payload of 100 million kilograms. With a mass ratio of 400, the initial mass would be 40 billion kilograms, or 40 million metric tons. That's roughly the mass of 200 aircraft carriers, or a small mountain. And this assumes fusion propulsion, which we haven't achieved yet. With current chemical or ion propulsion, exhaust velocities are far lower, mass ratios become astronomical, and the mission becomes completely impractical. You'd need more mass than exists in the asteroid belt. This is why generation ships remain firmly in the realm of theoretical speculation rather than serious engineering proposals. Even if we solve propulsion, the energy requirements are staggering. The kinetic energy of a 40 million ton ship traveling at 12% of light speed is approximately 2 times 10 to the 21st joules. That's about 500,000 megatons of TNT equivalent, or 10 million times the energy of the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated. This energy must come from somewhere: nuclear fuel, antimatter, or some other concentrated energy source. Generating, containing, and safely utilizing such enormous energy pushes the limits of physics and engineering. Financial costs would be equally astronomical. The International Space Station, humanity's most expensive space project, cost roughly $150 billion and masses about 420 metric tons. If we scale linearly, a 40 million ton generation ship would cost roughly $14 quadrillion, or about 140 times current global GDP. Obviously, scaling isn't linear. Bulk construction in space would be cheaper per kilogram. But even with optimistic assumptions, costs would likely exceed global GDP. Financing such a project would require redirecting a substantial fraction of global economic output for decades or centuries. Would humanity ever commit such resources to a project with no tangible return? The history of large-scale projects suggests skepticism. We built the pyramids, the Great Wall, Gothic cathedrals, monuments that consumed enormous resources for religious, political, or cultural purposes. But these serve the people who built them, demonstrating power, honoring gods, providing employment. A generation ship serves only distant future people, most of whom aren't even born yet, and benefits them only if everything works perfectly. Governments fund projects based on electoral cycles measured in years, not centuries. Corporations focus on quarterly profits. Even long-term institutions like universities or religions struggle to maintain focus over centuries as priorities shift and resources become scarce. The multi-generational commitment required to build and launch a generation ship seems implausible given human organizational realities. Perhaps an alternative model is needed, a distributed effort across many smaller missions. Instead of one massive generation ship, send many smaller probes or ships, each with a higher risk of failure but lower individual cost. The idea is that even if most fail, a few might succeed, and the aggregate probability of success is higher than betting everything on one enormous vessel. This strategy mirrors biological reproduction. Produce many offspring, knowing most will die, but some will survive. It's also how humanity explored Earth. Many expeditions failed, but enough succeeded to gradually map the world. The downside is that smaller ships have less redundancy, fewer resources, smaller populations more vulnerable to genetic drift and demographic stochasticity. They're more likely to fail. You're deliberately sacrificing people on missions you expect to fail, which raises profound ethical questions. Is it ethical to send people on a mission with a low probability of success, knowing they'll likely die? If participants fully understand the risks and consent voluntarily, perhaps it's permissible. But how voluntary can consent be when it's shaped by economic desperation, social pressure, or ideological indoctrination? And can children born aboard ship consent to their participation? They didn't choose this life. It was imposed on them by their parents' decisions. These ethical dilemmas have no clear answers. Different philosophical frameworks reach different conclusions. Utilitarian ethics might justify generation ships if the expected benefit, spreading humanity to the stars, outweighs the suffering of those aboard. Deontological ethics might condemn generation ships as treating people as means to an end rather than ends in themselves. Virtue ethics might ask whether embarking on such missions reflects wisdom, courage, and other virtues, or hubris and recklessness. Religious perspectives vary. Some religious traditions might view spreading humanity through the cosmos as fulfilling divine commandment to be fruitful and multiply, filling creation. Others might see it as hubris, attempting to transcend the human condition and reach for godlike power. Still others might focus on the treatment of individuals, condemning any mission that causes suffering or denies people the opportunity to live full, flourishing lives. If you found these challenges eye-opening, you need to watch the video appearing on your screen right now. It dives even deeper into the brutal physical and biological barriers that make human survival in deep space nearly impossible. Prepare to have your entire perspective on space travel completely shattered.